I'm extremely happy, honored, and proud to introduce to you my very dear and distinguished former colleague, Professor Veena, who is the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University, where she long chaired the Department of Anthropology while also holding a joint position in the Humanities. Indeed, one of the greatest privileges of teaching at Johns Hopkins, and in my case directing the Humanities Center there for many years, has been the intense cooperation, the sharing of students and projects, the co-organizing of workshops with Professor Duss and the other members of that most congenial and solidary of all departmental partners, the Department of Anthropology. Before joining Johns Hopkins University in 2000, Professor Duss taught at the Delhi School for Economics for more than 30 years, and subsequently held an appointment at the New School for Social Research from 1997 through the year 2000. Professor Duss has also been a regular visiting professor at several numerous universities, the Université de Paris, Sorbonne, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, Cornell College, and the universities of Heidelberg, Hamburg, Chicago, and Harvard Divinity School. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Academy of Scientists from Developing Countries, and she's a member of the Board of Trustees at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Professor Duss was further awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 2009 and the Anders Retzius Award of the Swedish Academy, the Swedish Society of Anthropology and Geography in 1995, as well as the Gurje Award in 1977. She received an honorary doctorate from the University of Chicago in 2000 and from the University of Edinburgh in 2014. And she's actually on her way after this event to Britain again, to the University of Durham, where she will also receive an honorary doctorate. Recently, she was also awarded the Nessim Habib Prize by the University of Geneva. Among her many and often reprinted books and groundbreaking essays, I will mention here the following: Structure and Cognition, Aspects of Hindu Caste and Ritual, published in 1997 and 2012, Critical Events, an Anthropological Perspective on Contemporary India, 1995, the Oxford India Companion to Sociology and Social Anthropology, all three of these titles published by Oxford University Press. These titles, however, hardly begin to indicate the wide range of disciplines, fields, and interests Veena Duss's research covers. In a variety of studies, she has rigorously and imaginatively explored a central, systematic, much more than simply methodological question, namely, and I paraphrase her own words here, how does ethnography generate concepts? And more specifically, how might we treat philosophical and literary traditions from India and other regions as generative of theoretical and practical understandings of the world? Or again, how could we render the texture and contours of everyday life, the way everyday events are joined together in the making of what is considered the normal and what is the critical? Among her recent books, I would like to mention in particular the following: Life and Words, Violence and the Descent into the Ordinary, published by the University of California Press in 2007, and prefaced by Stanley Cavell. Affliction, Health, Disease, Poverty, published by Fordham University Press in 2015, and published in a remarkable book series entitled Forms of Living, co-edited by two graduates, one of the Humanities Center and the Department of Anthropology, namely Stefanos Geroulanos and Todd Myers, both currently faculty members at NYU. And then there are the numerous co-edited volumes. Violence and Subjectivity with Arthur Kleinman and Pamela Reynolds, University of California Press 2000. Anthropology in the Margin of the State, co-edited with her colleague Deborah Poole, and published by the School of Advanced Research Press in 2014. The Ground Between, Anthropologists Engage Philosophy, Duke University Press 2014. Living and Dying in the Contemporary World, a compendium, a massive 800-page volume co-edited with her colleague Clara Hahn and published by the University of California Press in 2015. And if I'm not mistaken, the forthcoming special issue of the journal Current Anthropology under the title Politics of the Urban Poor. Professor Das is the author of many articles on feminist movements, gender studies, sectarian violence, and medical anthropology, whereby she consistently seeks to understand, in her own words, the long-term cultural logics, as well as the slow everyday flow in contemporary social events, as well as personal moments of rupture and recovery, and wherein she often lets herself be informed by the study of ancient, medieval, and contemporary texts in Sanskrit, Hindi, and Urdu, all of them languages and cultural archives she has either thoroughly studied and knows firsthand, and which, as she shows in minute detail, bear on anthropological issues. To give you a flavor of this approach, consider the theme and argument of words and life, in many respects a magnum opus. In it, she analyzes the need to retrace and evaluate the so-called descent into the ordinary, so as to understand the ways in which subjects and victims overcome the lasting impacts of everyday violence, triggered, for example, by the incendiary rumors and communal riots that punctuate modern life in India, thus focused here, but certainly also elsewhere. Among several themes, this work discusses the figure of the abducted woman during the period of the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan, and the divisions between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. It analyzes not only the impact of urban and communal violence on citizens as sexed, and hence suffering as gendered, but also the ways in which in turmoil and horror there is an allowance for the national state to emerge, imagine, and portray itself as the medium and protector of a more rational and fundamentally purified, and by implication masculine, social order. And with this tendency, and I'm grossly simplifying here, she compellingly contrasts an alternative possibility, namely the ways in which certain regions of the past may find themselves nonetheless actualized in subjects of victimization, so as to allow for new showings of life after symbolical death, and so as to create a sense of continuity between events that might otherwise seem unconnected. Professor Das's work further stands out, in my view, by its serious and very explicit consideration, appreciation, and recasting of 20th century and contemporary philosophical debates. Indeed, it is especially the tradition of so-called ordinary language philosophy and moral perfectionism which deeply influences Veena Das's conception of anthropology as an investigation of the everyday, ever since she first published a by now canonical article entitled Wittgenstein and Anthropology in the October 1998 issue of the Annual Review of Anthropology, emphasizing and detailing in that study, with and beyond Stanley Cavell's thoughts on the matter, Wittgenstein's later work, notably in the Philosophical Investigations, as one of a philosophy of culture. And here in this text, she lucidly speaks of the idea of culture as capability, of the horizontal and vertical limits to forms of life, of concepts of life in the face of skepticism, and the complexity of the inner in relation to questions of belief and pain. Interestingly, she asks here not only how Wittgenstein's philosophical ideas relate to ethnographic descriptions, but also how anthropology as a social science discipline and investigative practice may yet receive Wittgenstein's, and indeed not just Wittgenstein's, philosophical thought. In a host of extremely inspiring and influential interventions, Professor Das further has spelled out the growing significance of the philosophical writings of J.L. Austin, Stanley Cavell, Cora Diamond, John McDowell, and Charles Travers for precisely the anthropological theorizing of the ordinary. Parallel to the recent so-called ontological turn in anthropology, and often ascribed to the work of Philippe Descola and others, Das has made not only productive use of all these aforementioned authors in her own fieldwork, ethnography and anthropology, but she has almost single-handedly secured ordinary language philosophy and its linguistic phenomenology into the standard reference in her field and in the theoretical social sciences more generally. A very good example of that intervention is the aforementioned volume that Professor Das recently co-edited and entitled, I mentioned it already, The Ground Between Anthropologists Engaged Philosophy, to which she contributed an essay entitled Action, Expression, and Everyday Life, Recounting Household Events. Yet another example can be found in the recent observations in the forthcoming volume, with a new translation by an anthropologist this time, of Wittgenstein's 1931 remarks on Fraser's The Golden Bough, remarks that came out posthumously in 1967 and are now brought out again under the general heading, The Mythology of Our Language, with Veena's commentary and that of others, David Graeber and Michael Hewitt among them. And this volume invites readers to return to the times that philosophers and anthropologists interested in concepts such as mana, taboo, potlatch, and magic, testing the limits of belief and of reason, cross-fertilized each other's work. One can think of Marcel Mauss, Yves Durkheim, Henri Bergson, not to mention Claude Lévi-Strauss, and their different theoretical legacies, but of course also of the early Frankfurt School and even the early German and French phenomenological schools of thought, with Martin Heidegger and Levinas to begin with. More specifically, Professor Das here treats the subject of the fragility of beliefs in an essay suggestively entitled Of Mistakes, Errors, and Superstition. And then there is the powerful and lengthy chapter entitled What Does Ordinary Ethics Look Like? In an equally remarkable volume, in the format this time of a masterclass with other contributions by Michael Lambeck, Didier Fassin, and Webb Keane, entitled 4 Lectures on Ethics, Anthropological Perspectives, published in 2015 by HAU Books. Here, Das and her fellow anthropologists, quote, rather than treating ethics as isolable domain in moral theory, seek to grasp precisely how the ethical and the moral emerge from social actions and interactions, how they are related to historical context and cultural settings, and indeed form an integral part of life. Hence, Veena Das's more specific and deeply philosophical or eminently anthropological, hard to say which is which, question, namely, how do we align concepts with our lives? Or also conversely, what gives concepts life? From 2000 until 2012, at my invitation, Professor Das generously accepted to chair the International Advisory Board of the Future of the Religious Past, an interdisciplinary program devoted to religions religions, presumed words, things, gestures, powers, and also concepts. A program that I was asked to lead and that was sponsored by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, with over 5 million euros, which we spent very happily, in order to foster research and international conferences at Dutch universities, in addition to bringing out an international mini-book series with its proceedings on these precise topics. Thanks in large part to her wise and faithful guidance in this project. It was one of the most fruitful collaborative projects I have had the good fortune to participate in, and I look forward to many more. It is with great anticipation, therefore, that I offer her for today. Her title this afternoon is Ethics, Self-Knowledge, and Words Out of Place. Please join me in welcoming Veena.
Thank you very much, Hent. I'm absolutely delighted and feel very privileged to be invited to the starting of the seminar on theory and criticism. And I'm sure you're going to have a wonderful 6 weeks with Hent in guiding the entire process of the seminar. Thank you very much for coming to listen. I have to say that that having Hent in my life was at Johns Hopkins was really one of the most inspiring times for me, and it really hurt me when he said my ex-colleague, because you know, in some ways, it kind of made real the fact that in the next few years, I'm sure we will be talking a lot, collaborating a lot, but you can't imagine how great it was to be, you know, just discussing any old thing from Wittgenstein to Heidegger to miracle to magic, you know, just walking from one meeting to another or coming across one another and suddenly plunging into conversations like that. So thank you very much, Hent, for everything you contributed to the collaborative projects of anthropology and humanities. I must say I was also very reassured to hear this marvelous introduction, not only because it reassured me that I had, you know, done some things which Hent really liked, but also because it reassured me that he hasn't lost his great love for brevity. So thank you very much, Hent, for that. Okay. So this is one of the chapters of a forthcoming book called Textures of the Ordinary. And I would be really very, very interested in getting your comments and your criticisms, because it's still in the process of revision. And as with many things, I mean, I have to write like 6 to 7 drafts to be able to let something go. And when I do let something go, there are anyway 6 to 7 rejections before actually anyone agrees to publish anything. So, you know, it gives me a lot of time to really think. And so I look forward to being here very much. Can get the next slide. So I'm starting with a citation from Cora Diamond, which has had a very great influence on how I think about ethics, which is that when she's basically arguing that just as for Wittgenstein, there's no particular domain which one would say is the domain of the ethical. So you don't just say you know, here I am, I'm now doing economic activities, and now I move into doing something which is ethical. But rather, just as she argues that logic penetrates all thought, so ethics has no particular subject matter, and that in some ways it's about an attitude to the world and life. And I'm very intrigued by the question of what does it mean to think that ethics concerns in some ways the world as a whole, life. And I want to see ethnographically to move forward on this particular question. So, what does thinking of a world as a whole or life actually entail? And I wonder whether thinking about everyday life might actually make us think about the question of how to think about ethical life in anthropology. Get the next slide, please. Okay. So, one of the first things I think which is important to consider is that the elusiveness of everyday life, the fact that it's not, I mean, people keep asking me, but where is the everyday? And I'm very reminded of Wittgenstein saying that if I say I'm in pain, you can ask me where is the pain, and I'll be able to point to something. But if I say I'm suffering and you say where are you suffering, it would actually be a very inappropriate action. So, in some ways it seems to me that the question of everyday life in some ways is the question really of the elusiveness, and so that everyday life, precisely as I will argue, precisely because it is before our eyes, is actually extremely hard to see and to conceptualize. And so, one of the first things that I take from Cavell is the idea that everyday life has to be imagined, and that in its imagination, it would be the way in which you imagine it that the threats to everyday life will also be imagined. So, for example, if your picture of everyday life is that of the domestic, then in some ways it stands to reason that threats to everyday life, what he says philosophy calls skepticism, will be represented as threats to forms of marriage, namely in forms of melodrama and tragedy. And he goes on to argue that you know, one of the so he gives us two pictures through his own analysis of films and his two books, Pursuits of Happiness and Contesting Tears. And he's arguing that in his book Pursuits of Happiness, the question for both the books is that given the fact that in any future of a marriage there will be threats to togetherness, there will be betrayals, there will be you know, disappointments, so anything outside of Eden is likely to accumulate all these hurts. And so the question is, can two people continue to live together despite these hurts? And he says the question in Pursuits of Happiness was yes, where he considered a whole genre of films. Yes, because they are committed to a future together, but they do not know what the shape of this future will be. And in Contesting Tears, the answer is no, because there is a dominant male voice, and that the women in these movies, Gaslight is a very good example of that, or Letter from an Unknown Woman, that for these women they prefer solitude or even death rather than submitting themselves to a dominant male voice. So, if everyday is imagined and it cannot be seen, it will announce itself through the emissaries that it sends. You know, Heidegger's notion that what cannot be, what you cannot see, such as time, you can only see through the emissaries that it actually sends, or disease only announces itself through the symptoms that you can actually see. So that in some way starts with the question that everyday life is both that which is closest to us and also that which is most distant to us. And so in my work, I've thought about everyday life both through processes of habituation, but also through rehabituation. That is to say, the idea that everyday life is always built in a certain sense on disappointments, on in some ways ruins of one sort or the another. So if we start with thinking of everyday life as habit, you know, the conventional view of habit would be that it's the flywheel of society, it's the most conservative element in any given society, that it narrows the range of the possible, as Ricoeur argued. But later work also tends to show, and Rawilson's translation of the book on habit, which was actually pretty late in English, actually really makes us relook at habit in very different ways. So that it has a double aspect, namely a sedimentation of experience. This was something very, very central to Bourdieu's notions, for example, about the logic of practice. But that it also has the other aspect, which is responsiveness to the milieu, because if habit is durable, and if we are not machines who automatically repeat everything, then quite clearly its durability would assume that there is a certain kind of responsiveness to the milieu. Now, we'd have to see what shape this particular kind of responsiveness actually takes. So, there is a combination of familiarity and strangeness as predicates of the everyday, and this is what Quell, but before him Freud, came to name the uncanny of everyday life. The fear of, in some ways for me, the fear in a certain sense that habit might make you think that your actions, or might make you experience your actions as machine-like. And I've tried to show in my earlier work how within habit there are very small acts of care. For example, it's a very quotidian example, but I was always very struck by the fact that I would be sitting in a shanty with, you know, this little space, and a woman would be making tea for the children and for husband and for me. And day after day, she would remember that so-and-so likes cream floating on it, or that so-and-so likes sugar in it, or that so-and-so likes this kind of a cup and not that kind of a cup. And, you know, given the kind of lives within which this is, you know, in which survival is at stake every day, it was absolutely astonishing to me how much care could be woven into the notion of habit itself. Now, many people have thought that these ideas are completely new, and I give you just a very short citation from Durkheim, which is quite an astonishing footnote that he has in elementary structures, in elementary forms of religious life. You know, where he says that when various individual consciousnesses are synthesized into a collective consciousness, he argues that life unleashes itself from the reality, from the ground of reality. And these moments which appear in Durkheim are actually constantly tamed, I would say, by the overall task that he has set himself, which is to show that the ground of all being is the social. But it's actually fairly interesting. In a larger paper, I actually show different kinds of anthropological texts in which this particular way in which life is thought of comes up even against the author's own inclination. So I will give you two ethnographic examples. One is an example of, I did fieldwork in many different contexts. The first example is from the fieldwork I did in 1970s. So you will have to remember that the people who are speaking to me at that time, the ethnographer who is doing the fieldwork, was a very young woman as compared to the person who's writing now. And this is one of the uncanniness of ethnographic writing, that you see yourself in different kinds of times also. So this is a very brief example that appears in my book, Life in Words, but something that I don't expand much on. And the example was a woman who was dying, and she said, "Do not cover me in a shroud sent from my brother's house." This was a very unbidden, unanticipated dying request. But it immediately threw the relatives in a complete tizzy, because in the gift-giving relationship, the last gift that a woman's natal family will send her is a shroud from the brother's house. The brother has a very great significance in constantly enacting the fact that the girl might have gotten married and is now, a wife and a mother and a grandmother in a different kind of lineage, but that the natal family has never really let her go. So in some ways, it's a sign of the enduring longing for the sister who had, or the daughter who had to be given away in marriage. And so for a woman to refuse that particular gift would be an absolute scandal for the entire family. Now, one of the things that happens with dying statements, and this is not the only one, there are other examples I have. I can't say there are too many, but there are also other examples I have where what is said at the dying moment is considered to be, it can be very, very volatile. But one of the ways in which people think of the dying statement is that at the moment of death, all kind of unseen forces can come and take control of the dying person. So they don't quite know whether the voice that spoke was the woman's voice, or whether in fact it was a voice of somebody else who had taken hold of the woman's body. And one of the whole processes of very elaborate rituals that follow is not only to make an ancestor out of the dead person, but also to ensure the safety of the dead, right? I mean, so, we know that we use terms like caring for the dead quite lightly now. We kind of have experienced this, like somebody in the funeral home will say, "Don't worry, I will take care of the dead body," right? But it's actually a very, very important part of the rituals for the dead. Now, what was very interesting to me was that I had done fieldwork. I tend to do very long periods of fieldwork. So I had known these families at that time, for almost 5 to 6 years. And I had thought that I was a part of the family, so to say. So the fact that this came not only as a surprise to the relatives, but it also came as a surprise to me, so that I couldn't quite decipher whether there were things that I had completely missed behind the kind of, it's like the still life of habit. And underlying it, all kinds of things are happening which I might have missed. So I call this, I give in the paper some details about very small betrayals, like the woman saying one day, "There's a rotating fan, it's very, very hot," and she suddenly says to me, "Your Uncle G," meaning her brother, had never really acknowledged that the fan was given by her as a gift to him, right? Or things of that kind, which were like very, very small in some ways, but tended to show a kind of history of not quite being being respected or loved in the way in which she expected it to be. I called it the aesthetics of kinship and the aesthetic of gift giving, which is as important as the question of what are you giving in a gift. So people will sometimes say that, you can kill somebody by the gifts that you give. And I'm happy to kind of elaborate that statement if you would like later on. But the important point over here is that there is, in a certain sense, things like these long kind of standing grudges. There is a term in Punjabi and in Urdu called gila. Can you take the next one? I'll come to that later. There's a term called gila, which basically means a kind of rebuke which is given only to those whom you love. So I would never say about an enemy that I have this gila against them. And these gilas can all accumulate around the fact that you were ill and your relative did not visit you, or you went over there and they did not, they didn't actually honor you as guests, and so on and so forth. But the point is that there is a recognition, even within the language, that love can be about care, but it can also produce rebukes, which can have very long-standing effects. So that's the first example that I have. The second example I have is again a dying wish in the ICU. This was many years later when my mother-in-law was dying. And as she was in the ICU, she suddenly kind of said, I want some cigarettes, I want some whiskey. In Bengali, she said like, fufu korbo, which was completely contrary to what her life had been, because she'd been an extremely pious woman. After my father-in-law died, she had refused to step out of the house. She had got married when she was 10, and it was that kind of home which she had made her own. So then suddenly, and nobody in the house had actually ever smoked or drunk whiskey, right? So suddenly for her to say, I would like some whiskey and some cigarette, you can imagine, I for one was completely thrown out. And, I won't go into the details of how I managed that, but essentially it was really a crisis where a priest had to come in and have her touch an apple and then go and give the apple to a cow, which then swallowed the, the bad karmas which were accumulating around her so that she could actually die, at least as peaceful a death in an ICU that you can imagine. The interesting thing over here for me was the fact that a single sentence or a gesture said from the deathbed could actually annihilate, in a certain sense, the entire life project. I mean, was this the same person who had lived such a pious life? Or, all my liberal friends were, oh, you should have really given her cigarettes and, this is what she really wanted. And for me, that would have been a complete negation in some ways of how disciplinedly she had pursued piety in her life. So it tends to show both examples, I hope, tend to show the volatility which is lying under the stream of habit. It's like a picture of still life, and under it you really have all these currents which are going around, which in some ways I'll come later to how ethnography attends to these particular currents. But, but for those who then think that the only way habit is interrupted is by strategy or tactics, for example, as Bourdieu imagines it to be, I think miss out on the fact that habit contains all this volatility within itself. So they say that there is no single key that will open the secret of what inhabiting life together has meant, and that includes a lot of very minor repairs, minor insults, but which can actually explode. And death is not the only time. There are other occasions when, in fact, it can also explode and has to be repaired or tamed, or it leads to breakup of relationships and so on. Let me get the next one. So one of the things is that there is a certain opacity of the self. That is to say, you might find, I've been talking about the other expressing desires and wishes which the kinship group has to contain. But now imagine yourself in that kind of place in which something comes out of your mouth which actually negates what your life has been about, right? So what is the opacity of the self? I draw attention to Emerson's essay on experience, on the death of his son, and his remarkable citation to say, the only thing grief has taught me is to know how shallow it is. Like all the rest, it plays about the surface and never introduces me into the reality for which we would even pay the costly price of sons and lovers. That is the inability, in a certain sense, to touch grief. So my colleague Cameron had argued that grief comes to pervade all experience in a very impersonal manner. And indeed, there is a certain way in which one could think that grief which has not been mastered then comes to suffuse the whole life. But I think that there is a darker thought which Cavell expresses, where he says that the death of the son gives birth to the philosopher father. So the name Waldo is actually buried throughout the text, and it is both what Cavell argues acts as a grave but also as a womb, so that there is a sense of the essay as pregnant with something new that would happen. And I call this a very dark thought because of the fact that in giving birth to categories that are diminutive and therefore in a certain sense announcing himself as a certain kind of philosopher, Emerson, that is a philosopher whose critique through these diminutive categories is a critique of the large categories of Kant, as Cavell argues. Clearly what Emerson in some ways is showing is the manner in which the question of the death of the son, his inability to touch grief, that is, to be able to suffer without experiencing it, in some ways, is, relates it to his own sense about the opacity of the self. So that takes me to the question of how do we actually look at this opacity of the self. And I argue over here, let's look at the question then as to what the first person is. That is to say, what does it mean when I say I? And many people have argued that the I is not an object like any other. That is, I might lay this paper aside and then or my specs aside, and then I may look around for it. But it would be a very weird feeling to think that I have laid myself aside and now I need to find myself before I can actually use the term I. So there is an asymmetry in some ways between the first person and the third person, in the sense that for the third person I might need to get evidence for certain things. For the first person, the evidence would not be of the nature, let's say, that a third person evidence would require. So most of the literature, I would want to argue, considers beliefs from impersonal third-person stance. And in that sense, the reflective, most of the people who've written on first person, third person, such as Webb Keen, will argue that it's very important that we are able to stand outside from our own experiences and to then see ourselves from a certain third person perspective. I'm not saying this never happens, but it seems to me that there are also very interesting things about why our authority over statements as first persons is not the same as our authority over statements over third persons. And I'll come to say what it means. But what I'm struck by is that in postulating this reflective self, the individual is imagined as reflecting and primarily in a judgmental mode when he's all alone or when she's all alone. I very rarely find in the philosophical discussion a question of what happens, do you not reflect on things in company of each other? And second, of course, is that I want to ask whether what is involved is issues of judgment or whether something else is at stake. So, just to take one example, what kind of errors of judgment would wound us? Now, imagine that I am, I say I believe it is raining outside, or I believe that there is a thunder, I can hear lightning outside. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, no, it was actually not a thunder. It was, children just exploding crackers. I say, oh, I didn't know that, I was mistaken. Now imagine that one of my really good friends, say Michael, who I've known to be sharing a lot of my sense of what it is to be a political person. I happened to be going by a rally for pro-life rally or a rally in support of Trump, and I find Michael over there. And I say, oh, could that really be Michael? And then I look closely and, I say, oh, no, this is just somebody who really looks like him. Now, this correction in a certain sense is of a very different order than the correction in the first case. So not all errors in a certain sense carry the same kind of capacity in a certain sense to wound, and this capacity to wound comes in the second case precisely because my beliefs about do I really know this person come to be questioned. So one might say, in thinking about the double aspect of the first person, my first question would be, in thinking about the first person only in relation to the third person, which, with one or two exceptions, is exactly how the first person is postulated, where is the second person? And I say this because, because in much before Benveniste, in 10th century writings on Indian aesthetics by the poet-philosopher Anandvardhan, he actually defines the first person as someone who speaks and the second person as someone who hears. And as far as the third person is concerned, it can move between being second person or being first person. So that's one question. The second is, does what holds for belief also hold for other sensations? This is actually very striking as to how much of the work on first person and the question about first person judgment and first person authority has centered around belief and not really around other sensations, right? Pain is, of course, another privileged example, but it's very interesting that that these two are one would think are two completely contrasting examples in some ways, but a lot of the work in some ways on the authority of the first person goes around questions of belief. And when it comes to that, the language game of reporting can be, this is from Wittgenstein, where he says the language game of reporting can be given such a turn that a report is meant to inform a hearer about its subject matter, not about the subject matter, but about the person making the report. There can be a double aspect, right? Austin said rightly that if someone says, do you believe it's raining outside? I don't look inside me, I look outside to see whether it is raining. But on the other hand, if you say that, I say I'm really hurting, your words really hurt me, right? At that particular point, to say that in order for you, have you spoken truthfully or not spoken truthfully, I need to see all the outside evidences that I can gather, would be a complete denial of the language game around notions of hurt or pain. Okay, can we get the next one? So let's say the first person statements are directed both outwards and inwards. As third person, however, I'm a person among other persons, and therefore in some ways there can be a certain impersonality with which I make statements to. Like if I say I wrote this paper to a group like this, it's a different kind of statement than in relationship to, even in relationship to somebody with whom I've been discussing this paper and telling the person how difficult it has been to actually write about it. There is a second person aspect to it that distinguishes statements of that kind. So in one way, the major point I'm trying to make over here is that it's not as if the first person statements are completely private. There is an addressee, right, or an imagined addressee. There's also the use of public language, so to say. I use language which is a shared language, right? But the difference in some ways is that in the case of the third person, I'm a person among other persons. In the case of the second person, there is something directed at you. I'm entrusting my words to you. It is similar to Cavell's distinction between passionate statements. So a statement like I love you picks you up. I don't go around, if I were to go around saying that to every third person that I met, you would think that there's something very weird about this, or that maybe she really means something else from love than what I understand love to be, right? So Cavell's point over here is a very interesting one, where he says that Wittgenstein's comments on private language are attempts to uncover a fantasy of a profound fear, a fantasy or a profound fear that I'm completely unknown, and more, that I am unable to make myself known, or that I have no control over how I make myself known, right? So in some ways, the private language argument is a deeply existential statement about what the nature of the fears around the issue really of being unable to make oneself known might entail. Moran, who also has a very, very interesting book on the first person, basically will distinguish between the third person and the first person by saying that as a first person, I am responsible. I have to have the avowal. I'm responsible for what I'm saying. But you can see that because even in Moran, the second person is completely absent, there is a certain way in which what my ethnographic examples showed and how I'm interpreting them is that they are really addressed to the small community of kinship or the small community of intimacy. So, when even as a dying person, and even in a public space of a hospital or an ICU, the woman says, don't let a shroud come from my brother's house. I've argued that what she is expressing is not a particular last will and testament given to the entire world, but an actual utterance of words that she trusts that her small community of love will know how to receive. And they know how to receive it by putting it in relationship to her entire life, rather than taking that as a separate action on which they have to act as if it were a legally binding statement. So that takes me to the question about intimacy in relationship to anthropologists love talking about kinship, and so I will have to bring something around kinship and intimacy. And if very recently, but this has been actually a very old problem of thinking about kinship as not only a set of norms and rules about inheritance and succession and descent and so on, but also what the texture of being together is actually in relationship to intimacy. And Janet Carsten gives a very, very interesting example of what she calls this mutuality of being, which is she gives this example of how her mother told her the story of how her mother had left the house to go and take a train for somewhere. And suddenly, as the train came in, she had this very compelling feeling that she must go back. She must go back and see her brother. And she had been very, very close to her brother. She comes back and she finds that the brother has been just diagnosed with leukemia, and he dies after a while. And Janet Carsten says that this story was very important to her because of the fact that this mutuality of being didn't result from any set of rules. It didn't result from formal obligation in which she would have said, this is something I must do for my brother, but a certain compulsion which came from the nature of their togetherness. So I appreciate that it really shows ethnographically what being together in kinship might be, but precisely because of the intimacy and the absolutely stunning kind of demand she's able to put upon herself, it also shows how the very same feeling can be subject to failure. And in the paper I discussed the fact that when I read her account, I was actually reminded of the fact of a very deeply wounding similar relationship which I had with my brother, where it was a absolute mutuality of being, and yet when he committed suicide, I had absolutely no idea that he was likely to commit suicide. And that led in a certain sense to a very lasting kind of notion that there was something that I was completely blind to, and that I couldn't see that there was a havoc being placed with a life that I had been so very close to. So these failures of kinship, in some ways, they're not like without repair. And Cavell gives us a very interesting example in his autobiography, in which he describes a very wounding case, which I will not go in any detail about when he's 9-year-old. And there's a particular interaction with his father, which he, as a 9-year-old, concludes. And he says, it's not that my father wanted me dead, it's that he wanted me never to have been born. And that's the opposite, in a way, as you can see, of Emerson saying, grief has taught me nothing. I can't touch the reality of my son's death, right? But Cavell says how he describes then these very small acts of care, getting up in the morning, putting the heat on, boiling the water, making breakfast for his children. And he calls these acts to repair the broken arteries of his childhood. So what is stunning in this, in some ways, is the fact that a very, very wounding relationship cannot actually be overcome except through very small acts of care, as Cavell described it, and in the longer paper I describe it in relation to myself. There are other ways in which these acts of care might take place, and I take 3 examples. One is an example of healing, not in the sense of healing a disease or healing a particular hurt, but the impulse toward healing when a whole society is seen as completely imbued with violence, betrayals, as Michael Poet describes for the early war period in China. And he argues that in some ways the performance of ritual over there was not an expression of harmony. I mean, most people had interpreted the same material to say the Chinese really valued harmony and that it was a representation of how harmonious Chinese society was. He does quite the opposite, and he says it's not that the ritual is depicting the harmony of the society, it's depicting a wish. It's in the subjunctive, so that it's enacting, in a certain sense, a particular wish of fathers and sons being in harmony with each other, and the performance of ritual being able to repair what seemed to be these pervasive conflicts in China. But what is very interesting is that Poet also argues that this subjunctive is something you cannot actually take in real life. So there is a sense in which, for him, the subjunctive is resolutely opposed to what is the actual. The second example is from Fevret Sadat, whose work on bewitching in the Bocage, where witchcraft accusations are very, very common. But what she does with exquisite sensibility is to show that bewitching is a certain kind of way by which a whole lot of diffused anxieties of somebody who's to become the head of the household and head of the farm are actually dealt with. So she says de-witching is a diagnosis, and I won't describe the details of de-witching, but it's through tarot cards that she does it. And essentially what it does is, in a certain sense, to make the head of the household recognize that his dispositions, namely that he does not want, he's of the disposition, the ones who come for de-witching are of the disposition that they don't want to exercise masculine domination over their sisters or wives, they don't want to be actually killing off the competitor, they don't want to be simply humiliating those who are not, who are competitors in wanting to become the head of the household. The opposite of that, you should go to the Punjab for that. The opposite is, of course, that the law courts are clogged with brothers fighting over land. And she's arguing that to have that disposition where you can fight with your brother, where you can dominate your wife, where you can dominate your children, creates these diffuse anxieties in many people, which are expressed in witchcraft accusations. And the task of the de-witcher, in a certain sense, becomes something which she describes, I think, with stunning precision, as opening up a conduit to evil, which is to say, opening up the fact that that this person's dispositions, he will become through this process somebody who will be able to actually do these things to the others. It's a very stunning example for me, because it tends to show me how it is that people who could be very gentle and who we would have known as people who could never even kill a fly, as to say, are actually trained then to become people who can face resolutely violence in wars or in other things demanded of them. The third model that I want to take is that of a novel from Andrea McKean, Brief Loves That Live Forever. If you haven't read it, I really very strongly recommend it, because all the stories, in a certain sense, are stories about very fleeting moments. Nothing actually endures. But what he shows is that these certain fleeting moments are precisely those through which the durability of this kind of massive structures of Soviet society are made to not carry an inner reality. So what is very interesting is that whereas for poet, the ritual is something which must always remain in the sphere of the subjunctive, because that's not what reality is. For somebody like McKean, it's the reality which is an as-if reality of Soviet society. There's nothing to it. It's simply the manner in which overarching power of symbols and overarching power exercised over individual tends to make them believe that Soviet society will last forever. And McKean shows with great love, I would say, that it's these very fleeting moments which make them able, just as these very small acts of care were offered against horrific possibilities, it's these kinds of small moments which might make, and he's not denying the torture and the broken bodies and the labor camps, they're all present in his stories. But he's saying that what makes those, in a certain sense, disappear as psychic realities is the fact that there is a possibility of love, however brief and however fleeting that might be. So disorders of kinship and intimacy then are woven in the possibility of inhabiting norms differently. That is to say, whereas a lot of the anthropological literature has been on ethics, has been around the around the differences between Durkheim, who is supposed to have enshrined the notion of ethics as a certain kind of moral obligation in relationship to the norms of society, and Foucault, who's supposed to have shown us particular practices of freedom. Although, I mean, nobody would deny that every time Foucault shows us a practice of freedom, he shows precisely where such practices of freedom fail. But but here, I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not an opposition. What is very interesting is that you can inhabit the norm and you can inhabit the norm differently. Second, is there a next slide? Secondly, the fact that you have a different way of inhabiting norms also means that the very things from our culture that we might receive as gifts might also be used to rebuke the culture with. And finally, on method, I want to say something. I had said words strewn about, and all the time I'm giving you examples of sudden eruptions of a particular voice, sudden eruptions of a dying statement, and I have many other examples of this kind. I found very interestingly in Cavell's early work, in his discussion on Endgame, where he says the words are all strewn about. And then he says that he describes this as a particular literary technique, where he says a phenomena I've often encountered in conversation and in the experience of psychotherapy is the way an utterance that has entered naturally in a dialogue and continues it with obvious sense suddenly sends out an intense meaning. And that intense meaning is contrary to what the conversation is actually being about. It summarizes an entire drift of a mood until then unnoticed and unexpressed, right? And this is the kind of thing that ethnography does. So I have examples, I'll give you just one. In the middle of an absolutely sedate conversation about reproductive histories being conducted by a public health person, one of the women just suddenly turned to me and said, I call my husband by his name. You might say, what's the relevance of a statement of that kind? Unless you put it in the context that's saying, I call my husband by his name, in the context of Hindu notions of what is a wifely duty, how a wife gives life to a husband and might also take away life from a husband, it implies, because a woman is never supposed to use the name of her husband. She'll say so-and-so's father, she'll even just say, oh gee, hi there, or something, equivalent to that. But what this woman was trying to show was the fact that she had, and that's how I got to that story, because I took that sentence very, very seriously. And then she told me that she'd had 10 miscarriages. She didn't have any child. So first she said, I don't have a child, so don't call him so-and-so's father because I don't have a child. And I don't have a child because I had 14 miscarriages. And I had 14 miscarriages because my husband was more interested in getting drunk and making me, he was more interested in making me pregnant than seeing that the child actually survived, right? So you can get these intense moments, in a certain sense, of people who suddenly make open a whole life world in the context in which everything else seems to be of one sort, and then suddenly something else is revealed as a certain kind of under life of the everyday world. So ethnography, it seems to me, is precisely about capturing these moments, as is literature, as is cinema, I would say. These drifts of mood revealing the texture of the everyday. It's violent and it's small, it's trust that small events might stand up to the large inequities and violences with which people live. Thank you.
Ample time for questions, observations, suggestions coming out of the report. Sorry, yes.
Thank you, Professor Das. It was a wonderful, amazing lecture. It was kind of interesting that your ideas are about ordinary language and ordinary everyday, but you pick up the examples which are ordinary but in a kind of an extraordinary way, like the situations of death or situations of like horrific tragedy. It kind of reminds me of, apart from how we frame the author or the narrator in a kind of first person, second person, third person way, the demands of the narratives itself, like for example, the way Karen Barad makes this argument that the apprentices make us as much as we make them or make things through them. So I was just wondering, like, you made epistemic choices of selecting these events, and how do these events kind of make your narrative, or how do narratives inform your choice of taking these events in the first place?
Yeah. So the question was that these are in some ways extraordinary statements, like said at the deathbed, or and there is a certain kind of interruption of the ordinary, if you will. And so how does narrative, in a certain sense, create the subject? Is that the create, or why do I choose those and not some other statements? So this is the interesting thing that, yes, I mean, these are more dramatic than other statements, but there are, like this one, I call my husband by his name, right? Could have just been let go. It became extraordinary because of a certain sense that there was something else that was happening. But I'll give you another example of a completely ordinary stories. So I'm doing this work small work in Pakistan where we are asking rural girls if they would write diaries about themselves. This is the first time they've ever been asked to write a diary, right? And you get this relentless repetition. I got up in the morning, I read the Fajr namaz, I then made tea for my father and my mother, I then got the children, my brothers and sisters ready to go to school. I mean, these are elder daughter's diaries, right? Then suddenly within it, you might get things like, I was so tired today that I said to the Prophet, I'm really very tired. And I remembered the hadith in which Fatima had gone to the Prophet and said, I'm so tired with housework. And the Prophet had said, Fatima, you are the person who will lead others into heaven. And Al-Bukhari had interpreted it as saying that domestic work is actually ennobling, right? And then she says, which is, I'm just nothing compared to Fatima, so why do I complain? No? This is again a very simple, in some ways the diary is just relentless repetition. What would you find in something like that, right? But then what you see is the manner in which this sense of tiredness and drudgery and unfairness of the fact that, that she has to do all the work, right, tends to then be given a particular structure, which is both a rebuke, but it's also a certain, acceptance. So I'm not saying that they're always heroic kind of, resistances, but that in some ways people do, do make within these narratives of the ordinary what is also something which strikes me as extraordinary, which is why, I argue that everyday life for me is a certain kind of stitching together of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Right? It's not like the extraordinary we have to stand outside. It's actually, I mean, to me it was really extraordinary just suddenly reading something of this kind to kind of just, I mean, it's true that these are girls who've gone to school, they've got lessons in Islamia, they, are more textually oriented than their mothers were. But nevertheless, the fact that they would receive it in this way to talk about a certain kind of injustice which they cannot otherwise voice seemed to me to be very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that. As a Victorianist, I guess I approach habit.
Sorry,
as a Victorianist,
yeah.
19th centuries, I approach habit in kind of a different way, or I guess with different associations. In the 19th century, habit was often talked about as something that had to be explicitly cultivated and affirmed. So Victorians were very anxious about, for instance, the formation of habit or the creation of practices of life that would thereafter become kind of subconscious and repetitive. But there was a lot of anxiety, again, around that period when those practices were being ingrained, I guess. So I'm wondering what, how that might kind of affect your work, to think about the everyday as something that is not only, experienced or hidden or, noticed without being seen, but also potentially something that can be actively curated.
Oh, I think that's a great, so this is about habit and about the cultivation of habit. And you're absolutely right. So when I said it's a residue in a certain sense of experience, it's precisely that a whole lot of work has gone into making that something which will become something that you actually produce, right, out of your own body, so to say. But my point is that for anything to be durable, it cannot be sheer repetition alone. Within that repetition, there must be differences. So for example, if you go back to somebody like Erasmus, it's very interesting to see that in his book on civility, one of the things that it's a short book, and one of the things that he constantly emphasizes in that is the ability to sit around a table, to use a knife and fork, to use a serviette, to be able to make polite conversation, right? Now, this was obviously an enormous task with young children to be able to actually, get them to do that. The point that I'm trying to make is yes, but that's not the end of the story, right? The further thing that I would argue is that habit then is not simply a residue, right? That's what the hope is. That's what the pedagogues want, that it should become so habitual that you just perform it. But it's really the fact that people will, and I gave you this example about this diary, for example, where precisely to be a good Muslim daughter is to be able to do the domestic work uncomplainingly, right? And so they will adhere to the norm and do it uncomplainingly, but it's very interesting how within it, how something like the availability of a hadith of this kind will also express that uncomplaining nature is hiding a lot of complaints of which they're not unaware. They're perfectly able to express it, but they're able to express it in a way that seems like both an adherence to the norm and something which actually transgresses in interesting ways.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I don't know if I have a question, but maybe something to say about like your last example. I mean, like these small events you're speaking about, and it struck me somehow that I was struck by the fact that it's a moment in which it's not only you looking or speaking to someone or looking at the world, but it's a moment where something speaks to you and looks at you, back at you. And I don't know how this would relate to this question of the second person.
Related to?
To the question of the second person.
Excellent.
The second person.
Oh, the second person, yeah.
Because it seems to me that it's a moment where you're addressed by something in the world and you're asked to respond, but also to receive something from that world. And I was wondering in terms of your conception of ethics, how that would, as a question of the pressure of the world on your voice as an anthropologist.
Yeah. No, I think that's a brilliant question, which is really what does it mean to be saying on these moments, what does it mean, is the second person then not about eliciting a certain response? Yes, it is, by definition, that the second person is the hearer in some ways. The point I'm trying to make is that the same statement could have been addressed to third persons interpreted as a statement addressed to third person, say with legal force, if it was written in a will, right? It would then have the solidity of being interpreted in one way. But because it is addressed to the second persons, there is a certain way in which he's able to express something which others were not able to hear earlier, or at least if they heard it, they did not act on it. There was an absence of responsiveness to it, right? But she's also able to entrust, I'm arguing, both of them are entrusting their words to say, you will know what to do in relationship to my life as a whole, right? And that's where I think making it a second person, addressed to a second person, becomes very different than treating it as a statement addressed to the third person. So I'm very struck by the fact that even when the second person is introduced, in the literature on ethics, like in Shoemaker, it has that kind of thing where if something is addressed, then I have to think about what justification would that have, such as, Shoemaker has this example to say if you are stepping on somebody's toes, then the second person will, as a second person whose toe is being stepped upon, he will think it's not really right for him to be stepping on me, and just as I would not step on him, and then ask him to remove his foot. And my response is no, actually I will just say, please could you remove your foot, right? I don't need that structure of justification in an act in which common sense, I'm always reminded of Austin and Hare when Hare was trying to persuade Austin that he must, that these common justifications of third person justifications were very important. And he said, suppose a student comes to you and says, I'll give you 100 pounds. What will you do? And Austin said, what will you do? He said, I'll explain to the student that this is not okay because this is what the rules are and this would be bribery and so on and so forth. And Austin said, really, I would just say no, thank you. Right? So that, I think, is what is at stake, which is really that in our ordinary world, a second person is someone who has that immediacy. And that immediacy changes the texture of the statements in a way that imagining the third person, is something different. So it's the Sanskrit text that I was quoting, it starts by, this is how we know that is a different kind of text than, let's say, the texts on ritual. Although I'm not sure, I think okay. This particular text starts by saying Shunu Devi, which is Devi, listen. And then it gives the entire Tantra thing in which in a form of dialogue, right? The Mimamsa text, the ritual text will just say something like Swarga Kama Yajet, which is let one who is desirous of heaven perform the sacrifice, right? Which is an optional thing. If you have that desire, I'm telling you how to go about it. So there is a second person, but because, and it is a second person who's being addressed, although it's put as a general injunction, and this actually follows from the structure of Sanskrit in which you don't have to have a pronoun to be able to recognize a pronoun. The verb does that particular job, right? So I'm saying that there's something to be thought about in relationship to the centrality of the second person in thinking about the first person, but also in thinking about the third person.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating set of reflections. I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about the notion that ritual enactments.
The notion of ritual.
Ritual enactments occur in the subjunctive tense, or a way of ushering in a would-be world.
Yes.
That in relation to the place of habit in your formulation of everyday. So if you were to, move on.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. And really thank you for being such a good listener. Really, it's a fascinating question. So what happens with, say, poet is saying that a ritual of succession is enacted in which roles are reversed, right? And everything goes smoothly, right? The son doesn't kill the father. There is an orderly succession, whereas in real life, you know, sons are already killing fathers, and disputes over succession are killing brothers, and so on and so forth, right? Now, in some ways, I think where I have some difference from poet, I think this is a brilliant notion, precisely because everybody had always thought about ritual as somehow expressing the normative. So it's a brilliant notion, on that I have no doubt. I think where my difference is the fact that the idea, in a certain sense, of the subjunctive, in some ways then, for him, has this sharp divide between the subjunctive and the real, right? So he's saying, you know, this is not what we can occupy in real life. You know, we can be those kinds of persons up till then. And of course, he does say that this is not just catharsis, it's also that you are being taught to respond differently, right? But then he also says that this is not a world you can or even should inhabit because it is too perfect, right? Now, my argument over here is that in the ritual lives that I'm familiar with, for example, what I described, let's say, with regard to my mother-in-law and the fact, the cruelty of the rituals through which you are made to face death, right? And they really are. In the larger paper, I describe how, you know, using the word preta, which is ghost. So for a period of time, the dead person becomes a ghost before she can ascend to becoming an ancestor. But every time the ritual is performed, it will prefix the name with preta. So it will say preta Rajarajeshwari, right? And the wounding part of it, namely, I can't imagine that this person has a ghostly existence now, right? Creates in a certain sense, I mean, I know that it is make-believe at one kind of level, right? I know that this question is a, you know, is a make-believe. They all know it is a make-believe in some ways, right? So it's not like, oh, it has this particular character. It must be given this particular character so that the liminal period can be passed over, right? But it seems to me that there is a much more you know, much more knotted relationship between the actual and the subjunctive in that particular case. That's one argument. The second is about habit. Now, this is fascinating because, you know, in any ritual, at least the ones in India, and this might be more Hindu, I don't know, but in any rituals, there's always that kind of threat of the natural breaking up. You know, the bride is sitting there all decked up and suddenly she wants to go to the loo. You know, and then that creates this kind of thing, no, this is not really supposed to happen, right? Or, you know, the habit of your being able to recite the mantras correctly, right? They will say, but language has a very slippery existence, right? It's possible that I know I've recited this every day of my life, I don't know, probably whatever number of times. And that day, a particular slip of tongue happens, you know, and that slip of tongue opens the path for various gods and goddesses to come and completely turn the nature of the ritual to something else, right? It's that kind of way in which, in fact, the ritual is never completely secure, even though it is built into this space in which it is supposed to be secure.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the lecture. I wanted to ask about your concept of the everyday.
Ask about?
The concept of the everyday.
Yeah.
You described that to approach it diagnostically, it needs to be read for its symptoms. So we're always kind of looking at the everyday and its symptomatic existence. And what you had on the slide, what you spoke about was that we're looking for what is closest to us and simultaneously farthest away. And then in your discussion of the first and second person, temporality, I feel like, temporality entered the scene. Because the second person, as you described, has an urgency to that speech, whereas the third person might lack that same acceleration. So I'm wondering if you can speak about how the everyday and the temporal, kind of different temporalities that exist across the textures of the everyday, how that may be part of your work.
So let me see if I get your question correctly. Are you saying that so how in the speech act is the second person brought in? Is that
Well, so you described the second person as having more urgency, kind of coming with more of a temporal force, needing more of an immediacy in its response. And the everyday was described more in terms of spatial.
So first, the question is, of course, that simply because something is constituted as the first person doesn't mean that this is this person's voice, right? So one is whether your body in a certain sense is expressing you or whether it is expressing something completely different, right? And so one point of that is really that the first person is in that sense very complicated, because most of them will say just because I put a pronoun I doesn't mean I'm the one who's actually speaking. So that has to be actually deciphered. And the second person in that context becomes very, very important. I mean, okay, let me step back. That's true for the third person too for some purposes. For example, in law, if you say, I wrote this will and testament, and somebody else said, but you were under the control of the enemy at that time, Roman law will treat you as dead, right? You cannot act, or even if simple thing, you've had a surgery, one of the first things they'll tell you, do not make any will or any legal document for the next 3 days, because you're not really a person before the law. So however much I may say I, at that particular point, that's what at least they tell you in the operation theater, right? That if it is contested in a court of law, you will not be regarded as being in control of your own action. So the first person is itself a pretty unstable category from that point of view, precisely because yes, there is avowal, I take responsibility for it, but I'm not the only person who acts on that, right? So that's the third person. The second person, I think, becomes very important in these cases, because as I said, there is a sense in which the grammatical form is don't let anyone do this, right, in the first case. In the second case, it's I want to smoke, or bring me some cigarette or this, which we don't quite know. There is an instability over here, and the community interprets it as saying this is addressed to us, to her kinship people, right? We are the second person. We are not just the third person to whom this is addressed in a in an impersonal manner. We are not just persons among persons, but ones who are there because we are related. We have this kind of past, we have this kind of relationship, we have this kind of sharing. So the second person, I would say, has a particular history, whereas the third person's ability to interpret whether this is a first person statement or not depends very much on the fictions which it might actually create, such as the fictions of law, right?
So I have a question that's regarding clarification. I'll try to speak loud, but I don't have a voice that carries. I have a question that is a kind of clarification about the third person and self-reflection. And I seem to have understood that taking a self-reflective stand might be, in a way, taking a third personal attitude towards yourself, which is, I think, something that's also an idea of reaching around, but that doesn't matter. So my question would be, do you think that there are different kinds of self-knowledge, depending on whether they come from self-reflection or from kinds of recognitions or epiphanies that come with second-person interaction? And similarly, if there are kinds of self-opacity that are proper to self-reflection and others that are proper to second-person relations. I was wondering if something of this sort was emerging.
So are you saying what would it mean for me to take a third person stance on myself versus a second person stance on yourself?
It seems that you were saying that through conversation there is an openness in interpretation that you kind of pose in a third personal relation to yourself, and therefore they're kind of discoveries that seem to be precluded. Or if I understood your point correctly. So I was.
There's always a particular indeterminacy of what kind of person is, that is grammatically, right? So even if the grammatical rule is absolutely clear, as a certain kind of philosophical stance that one would take, there is a question of where do you get indeterminacy and where do you get closure, right? And I think it's very interesting that so for most people, say Moran, all of these people, it's my avowal, which makes it very characteristic that this is a first-person responsibility. I think my point is that first, that when I said you seem to be totally alone when you're doing this reflexive stance on yourself, I think what I mean is that I'm actually, when I'm saying this, I'm saying this in the context of, let us say, for some purposes, what the law will have to say on it, right? So am I really free to say, I hereby declare, this person to be, can I just say, I declare this pigeon to be a predatory bird, right? It seemed a very peculiar statement, but this was Bruno Latour's point, that in a court of law, I can talk about the pigeon as a predatory bird because the law will allow these fictions in a certain sense and will allow my statement to be considered to be a true statement, right? In the context of second person, I'm not sure that these are not propositions, right? So it's not enough to say, are they true or are they false? It's that what kind of life do they actually have? And that's the argument that I'm making, that most of the time in the discussions, it's like a proposition. I've said this, and now we can have a discussion about, what's the first person, what's the third person reflexive stance, etc. Whereas the argument I'm making that from a Wittgensteinian point of view, the question would be what kind of life does such a statement have? And that life will entail, in a certain sense, whether which kind of second person, which kind of third person, who is actually involved in this. So I think that's the disquiet I have about the literature, but that by making it as if it was all about propositional logic, it reintroduces a certain kind of dominance of the proposition over other kinds of speech acts, and particularly it does not actually look at the questions of what kind of life can this be given in relationship to how somebody carries it forward, right? So in this kind of case, I think that there was a certain sense in which carrying this forward was left to the second person. You are my daughter, you know what I'm like, right? With it. And I'm not saying this is all conscious at all. I'm saying that this is the life it came to lead because of the fact that we could assume a second person stance on
it. The second person issue reminds me of one of Hannah Arendt's books. That Hannah Arendt wrote a book on Kant's critique of judgment, in which she reinterprets one of Kant's concepts called enlargementality, and she makes the point that we always need to position ourselves on another person's position, or try to see the world or think about the world from another person's perspective. Does that connect it to your previous?
But that's exactly what I'm contesting.
Yeah.
Right?
And also, the second person issue reminds me of a French phenomenologist called Jean-Luc Marion. And he has a point that everyone is both a first person and a second person at the same time. That because when one is seeing other people or making judgment upon other people, one is at the same time or simultaneously
in other people's view or being judged by other people. So everyone, I remember according to John Kumar, everyone is both a first person and a second person at the same time. And this actually compels us not to be too egoistic or too selfish. Because we need to think about that when we are making judgment upon other people, we are also, in certain sense, under the view, in the view of others, or being judged by others.
I mean, there's a particular fantasy of the social behind it, which is what I'm trying to contest. That's the fantasy of the social, that we're in this constant state setting in which, we are, I'm imagining what you will think and then thinking of myself in relationship to what you think. And I'm saying, no, I mean, there is a certain way. That's why I sort of said in Shoemaker, for example, if you say, oh, in order for me to ask you to remove your foot, I need to think about what a third person would have said, what the structure of justification would be, et cetera, is to completely negate what is actually one of the most common features of everyday life, which is you just say, please, can you remove your foot, right? So it's that kind of question on the one hand, and on your first question, that we always see ourselves from a third person perspective. I mean, one, it would completely take away, Anscombe has this wonderful thought experiment where she says that you could imagine that there's one name by which you call yourself, and that's inscribed on your arm. And then there are these names by which others call you, and that is inscribed on your back. And she says how, weird it seems to me that every time I need to say something, I look back and say, what was your name for me? And then I look back, yes, so and so, right? And then I give it to you. It's that kind of fantasy of either complete inexpressivity or being never in control over, what your own formulation or your own expressions might be. That's at the heart of Wittgenstein's critique of the private language argument. So, so I would say two things. One, it's precisely that obsession with propositional logic that seems to me a problem. And second, with judgment, right? It's as if we constantly look at a sensation only from the perspective of judgment. And I'm trying to say that really, even if that is true for certain, certain kind of games we might play with belief, there's no absolute symmetry between belief and sensation.
Thank you very much for this talk. I know you've been talking a lot about the ordinary, but I have a question about this. Thank you very much for your talk. I apologize, my voice also fails to carry it. You discussed much the ordinary and the natural, and I had a question about the supernatural, the way in which you talk about the kinship of being linked. There seems to be something, particularly with that example, where the sister knew her brother had leukemia and returned from afar, of a telepathic connection that seems to be here, where as sort of the opposite of the way in which Cavell talks about Wittgenstein's fantasy of a private language, a fear of not being able to be understood, never being able to be understood, that there's something of a movement here where towards being like where the families understand beyond the words, understand almost without words, just feel directly what the intent or before the words of the speaker. I was wondering if telepathy at all figured into your thinking of this.
Do you mind coming here? It'll be a bit of a walk, but because there were a lot of noises, at least I lost you in the middle. So I'm sorry about that.
My voice fails to carry. Yeah. But it was just a question about how how telepathy might figure here as the corollary to the Cavell's understanding of Wittgenstein's discussion of private language as the fear of never being able to understand or express oneself, and that that in both the sort of way in which you framed the kinship of being with, particularly where the woman knows her brother has leukemia from afar, or the way in which the family understands the deathbed wish deathbed wish to not be buried in her brother's shrouds as something that goes beyond the words, but is something that is felt before the words. And so I was wondering if how that figured into thought.
Yeah, no, I'm glad I asked you to come in. No, I think that's, so one of the things Cavell is absolutely clear about is that to understand you, for me to understand someone, doesn't mean I can see into the person's heart through and through. Right? He says even if the other person is made of glass, you cannot see and you should not see the other person completely, right? So I would assume that the possibility that language is wedged between us is always there, right? And so in a certain way, I'm not claiming that in acting upon this death wish in this way, rather than another way, they had really understood what the woman was saying. I'm saying the understanding over here is mediated by all the kind of social, not just conventions, but also by a certain absorption of the natural into the social, right? And so in a certain sense, the idea that this might be a ghostly voice which is speaking is not something which is an exotic fact, right? It's something so built, it's like, among the newer, the fact that your wife could be a witch is not a great exotic fact, although what it means for a person is actually something he does not, Evan Pritchard doesn't sell out, doesn't spell out its kind of phenomenology or geography of what that might mean. So I would argue over here that what I'm saying is that in terms of thinking how this is taken forward, I'm trying to show how a certain interpretation weaves the certain ordinary and the extraordinary, social and the natural, together for this sentence to be taken forward, right? So if it was that they have to say, oh, we really need to, and there are places where disputations can happen. Right? A disputation could have developed between, if there was a huge fight between, let's say, the girls. Let's imagine a family situation. This was not that kind of family, in which, let's suppose there have been real feuds between her brother's family and her husband's family. There, I would interpret the dispute in terms of the fact that this is a continuation of a particular kind of dispute. But let me give you one other example. There's a fantastic book by a Turkish lawyer who, at the deathbed of her grandmother, the grandmother told her, and they'd always thought of her as a very pious Muslim woman. Her grandmother said, look, I'm an Armenian. I will, because many Armenians were forcibly taken away from their parents and adopted by army families and so on. And she said, I'm an Armenian, and actually it's true that I've performed all the Muslim rituals, but in my heart I've been always performing Christian rituals. And so you should not let them perform any Islamic rituals on my death. I don't want the prayer for the dead, the janazah, to be actually recited, right? But the girl has no way, in the presence of all the her father and grandfather and uncles who come and take away the body and perform the rituals, right? She then actually tries to by some happenstance, she actually finds the Armenian relatives, her mother's, those part of the relatives who somehow escaped and managed to come in the US. And then, you know, a different kind of memory begins to build of the grandmother and what her life had actually been about. So these are profoundly social things also, right? And that's part of the argument that I'm making. It's never just something said in the isolation of your study while you're smoking a pipe, right?
I ask you a question which has to do with something that we have often discussed in different contexts, but what is the relationship, if any, there is, between, let's say, thinking of ethics in terms of the ordinary as it relates, as you beautifully described, to certain understanding of the habitual, which would mean that ethics is not based upon abstract principles, but it's in a sequence, in a series, or an iteration of small gestures of repair that a whole of a life acquires a meaning. And on the other hand, let's say, understanding ethics as driven ultimately as premised upon not so much the ordinary as the habitual, but upon the extraordinary. Meaning here now nothing deeply metaphysical or perspective or even supernatural, but let's say, as you put it so beautifully in the last slide, that one small event can somehow redress the greatest of horrors. And there it would seem that the modality of the ethics in terms of the everyday is that of a singular, unique moment. Doing what Wittgenstein, I think, beautifully describes in the lecture on ethics, where even, I think, grammatically, somewhat strangely, speaks of ethics as regulating for the whole of one's life. So, for the ordinary ethics, as you conceive it and rethink it, is it important to ask oneself, well, ethics becomes almost what Levinas says about Vasily Grossman and his Russian novel, Life and Faith. It's neither God nor be good, but it is like small acts of goodness. And these somehow build up the wholeness and the meaning of a whole. Or would the ethics of the ordinary also allow for the possibility that one small event gets to regulate for the whole of one's life, which would be, which would not require and perhaps even forbid something like a series or a repetition or a habitualization, or are these two aspects of one and the same vision, as it were, that you are elaborating?
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a great question, and I can't say I have a very confident answer to this. I veer one way and I veer another way. So one is really that I'm not making a contrast between habit as primarily repetitive. I think it is repetitive. And there is a certain thing on routine. But there is within this habit and routine also volatility. Right? So volatility doesn't come when it can come. You know, it can come from very big. Suddenly, a war changes everything that you do. But on the other hand, even in that changing everything you do, there are some things which will persist in terms of how you do them, etc. So I'm not kind of overlooking. So somebody like Pierre Georgiou will say, here are two different models, right? One is when there is a huge event and then there is a return to the ordinary. And the other is where there are very small things that are happening, but they're volatile enough and there's still a question of what is what is it that is a return in a certain sense to the ordinary. And I've seen both in my work in many ways, and been impressed by the fact that more than thinking about these as completely different, I'm interested in the, in the way that they're stitched together, which also means that there will be gaps, but that there will also be a certain kind of stitching together which tends to happen. So that this thing that one statement can and does give you insight into the fact that this life which you had thought is of this kind turns out to be completely different, or turns out to be something that you had not anticipated. But it can do two things. It can either show you that things which were a little inexplicable before become explicable. So I don't know, like this Turkish law, although the mother, the grandmother has performed all the pious rituals, for as a Muslim, right? Nevertheless, internally keeps creating. She observes. She says the. She says the Hail Mary, and she says, she remembers these biblical verses, etc. I think it's a very interesting question. What does it mean to then think that her understanding of herself clearly cannot be simply reduced to the subject formation through procedures of power, right? That's one, I think, interesting point, that what's happened a lot is that I love Foucault, but because of the dominance of Foucault, I think there has been this assumption that the subject is completely colonized by the idea that the subjecthood is always in relation, subjectivity is in relation to the subject, and the residue is then left over to psychologists, and this is the point Reckman makes, right? So that's one particular point. On the other hand, I also do recognize that, like some of Reckman's own work on the refugees in Kampuchea, basically has that prose of absolute relentless repetition. Get up in the morning, get into the fields, this thing, don't think, do the next thing, survive for the next 5 minutes, no future, no past, no lover, no husband, no child, right? In that kind of context, I would not know how to speak about subjectivity, for instance, right? And so I do recognize that there are these, end situations. I've been reading the Guantanamo Diaries, and again, it's the absolute relentless repetition. Whereas if I read somebody like Shaila Talebi's book on, of her experience of torture when she was from 18 to about 24 in an Iranian jail, there is both the kind of wounding by the fact that the torturers insisted that she call them sister, or that that as coming back they would steal some grass because it was Navroz and they were going to put something there in memory of Navroz. So I think that in the extreme kinds of situations, I do think that there is a point of of the Kampuchean form of torture, or the Guantanamo form of kind of torture, where it becomes very hard for me to imagine what talking about subjectivity would actually mean. And so that's where, in a way, my, I don't want to fill it up with ideological words where I cannot have access to that experience.
The last question. Yeah.
I've been thinking about your title. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Sorry?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I've been thinking about your title, Words Out of Place, and how it actually, your presentation, your lecture reminded me that it perhaps could be rephrased as place out of words. I got a very strong sense of place based on all of the examples that you were using. And so I'm wondering, as someone who's not very familiar with ethnography or anthropology at all, Do you see placemaking as part of your ethnographic work? And if so, do you use the first person to mark your own participation in that work?
Yeah. So I don't think the first person equates agency in the sense that, that if you are thinking about the agent as someone from whom action emanates, I'm actually trying to experiment with something different. I'm trying to think, that François Dastour has a footnote, the only footnote I've ever seen by anyone on Panini in this tradition, where she says for Panini, this is the great, 2nd century BC grammarian, and Panini imagines the world as the language is primarily made up of verbs to which other things are attached, right? So yes, there is a term, so there is a sense in which all the declinations will have how you decline a verb in the as agent, as object, as instrument, etc., etc. But the idea of the agent over there is one who retrospectively claims responsibility for the action, right? It's not like it's first coming from you and this is what drives your action, because in the theory of action, you can be there in the beginning of the action, but you can't be there at the end of it. So it can only be retrospectively claimed. I think this is a different kind of notion. And it doesn't mean that you are making people into machines or you're making people into, into something else. But it is a particular notion in which a lot of emphasis on intentionality is made to do much more work than it can actually do, right? And from that point of view, I find agency a little less theoretically compelling than it has been. It has very strong ideological kind of notions, and it served a lot if there were people who were considered as not capable of becoming agents. I completely agree with that. But I think there's something we can go much further. And that's the kind of question that, So I wouldn't want to put it in saying, was this woman Sita's agency denied when her wish was not respected? Because the other person is not so transparent in some ways, right? And so how to deal with that set of issues requires, I think, much more tact and much more calibration than a pure distinction between saying, here is the agent, here is the object, here is the instrument, which actually allow you to do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the break.